This is Steve Zeltzer with Pacifica, and we've covered the whole struggle of AI. There's now a national strike of 11,000 writers on AI, and there's an important bill that's been introduced in the California legislature, AB 886, that would have something to do with digital workers and journalists and how the profits from these technologies are being distributed. And joining us is Matt Pearce, who's the president of Media Guild of the West, and he's part of a group that's introduced this bill, which is going forward in the California legislature. Welcome, Matt, to our show.
Nice to be here, Steve.
So, Matt, why don't you talk about AB 886, what the bill is? It's called the California Journalism Preservation Act.
Absolutely. So AB 886, California Journalism Preservation Act, or CJPA, as many of us call it. It's a bill that's designed to try to level the playing field between news publishers, and this could be anything from newspapers like the Los Angeles Times, where I work as a reporter, to radio stations that have online websites, to nonprofit newsrooms. A lot of these places now, we obviously publish journalism on the internet, and a lot of people reach that journalism through Google or through Facebook or Instagram. And those companies, those platforms, Google and Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, have made billions and billions and billions of dollars off of owning the infrastructure of the internet, owning the way that we see and receive and transmit news. And so publishers have argued for years now, not just in California, not just in the US, but around the world, that Google and Meta have become essentially monopolies in the digital advertising space. And not only are they monopolies in the digital advertising space, but they control like what journalism that people see. And so they have been masterminds behind this type of legislation that would require Meta and Google to pay a fair share of the advertising revenue that they profit off of our work. We're the ones creating the journalism. We're the ones who go out there interviewing people, photographing them, analyzing the big news of the day. We distribute this journalism to our readers, but the argument of this sort of legislation is that Google and Meta have been profiting unfairly off of our work. And so this bill seeks to level the scales.
And the effect of the digital development in journalism, why don't you talk about how local news has been affected? How has it affected the information that workers and people in this country are getting as a result of this restructuring?
That is the billion-dollar question, actually probably bigger than $1 billion question. So, go back 20 years, 2006, you have this era where the internet's already a thing. People are already starting to use personal computers to look at the internet. But we have all of these news organizations all over the place in every part of the country that would report on local affairs. They would be the people who are reporting on the local city hall. They might go to a neighborhood council meeting. They might be reporting on their school district. There were a ton of journalism jobs out there, just tons and tons of people who are in big towns and small, who were focused on just local community affairs. So with the rise of Facebook and Google and a bunch of other things, obviously, the rise of the social media era, combined with a bunch of other factors, has created this situation now where, zoom forward to today, tens and tens of thousands of journalism jobs in local communities have been lost everywhere and have not been replaced. So think about this. We've had an enormous economic disruption in the way that we all get news about where we live. And I think, capitalism, people who are like in the business world, they talk about creative disruption, creating new jobs if you get rid of old business models that are no longer serving their purpose. Okay, but the thing is when these little newspapers disappear, when these digital newsrooms fold because they can't make it, they're not being replaced by other journalists who work for a new online startup in your town. They're not being replaced by somebody who works for Mark Zuckerberg, who's a professional journalist. They've been replaced by nothing. And so there have been these academic studies that have showed in a lot of these local communities that have lost newspapers, that have lost these journalism jobs, local corruption has gone up. Actually, the cost of bond measures have gone up because local governments tend to have lower ratings in places that don't have as much local reporting, holding officials accountable. There's studies showing that fewer people are aware of who even their congressperson is when they don't have a strong local journalism outlet that's keeping them posted on the news of the day. And so there's all this evidence piling up that our industry has essentially gone through deindustrialization. We got rid of all these local jobs that used to be manufacturing news in our communities, to use a sort of auto workers metaphor. And those jobs didn't get replaced. It's not as if those workers, those journalists, went and just happened to do the same thing in the same place for other employers. It's just gone. And so we're in this strange position of trying to figure out, what is it that we're missing? Like, what is it that we're not hearing? Because we're surrounded by noise, we're surrounded by information, we're surrounded by Facebook posts and Twitter posts and Google search results. Now we're surrounded by Chat GPT. We've got this world where the information we're getting may not have even been written by a human. And like, how do you know what's authentic? Like, how do you know what's actually happening in your community? How do you know it's not just conspiracy theory? It's not just propaganda? Like, there used to be these people who would try to help people navigate those sorts of questions, and they're just gone.
And maybe you can talk about hedge funds, because newspapers around the country, chains, have been bought by hedge funds. What is the effect on news and information and the journalists who work at these news companies when hedge funds come in to take over these concerns?
Yeah, that is such a great question, because it's been devastating. So as local journalism has gotten less profitable, it used to be families or maybe local business people who used to own these sorts of newspapers or newsrooms. But as they've gotten less profitable, those families, those local business people decide to get out of the business. They're just like, this is not profitable anymore. This is too much trouble. But there are these companies out there like Alden Global Capital, like Gannett, like McClatchy, that have become the largest newspaper publishers in America by buying up a bunch of these distressed newsrooms, because they have the economies of scale. They have huge chains where they can regionalize news production, or make the news more nationally focused in these small communities. So they find all these sort of efficiencies, I put in quotation marks, which means basically laying off local journalists so that they can continue to harvest the subscriber money from loyal local readers who used to read these newspapers. They can continue to sort of skim off the prestige of these local publications that built up trust, not only over decades, but over more than a century sometimes in some cities. And it's been devastating, because newsrooms that are owned by private equity or hedge funds have seen substantially more layoffs than places owned by local family ownership, that is maybe a little bit less about ruthless profits and more actually about doing local journalism and serving the community. And so this has been one of the consequences of the fact that the internet has kind of crippled the way that we used to fund journalism in our communities. But I will say, and I will make a controversial argument here, that I hate the hedge funds. I hate private equity as much as everyone else. Three units in my local actually are out on strike against Gannett today, another sort of Wall Street owned firm, because it just cuts and it cuts, and they just treat these journalists horribly at the bargaining table. But they are symptoms of a bigger problem, which is that when you just look at how journalism gets funded these days, the money is not there. And where are the profits? Obviously, Gannett, Alden, these hedge fund papers, they're profiting, or else they wouldn't be in this business. But it's pennies compared to the amount of money that Google and Meta are making off of the backs of local journalists, and have been for decades.
And why don't you talk about these strikes? Because journalists are just trying to do their job, their profession, and they're facing basically a war on their lives and their conditions. What is happening with these strikes? Who are they, and what kind of conditions do they face?
So right now, and this is Monday, June 5th, we've got hundreds of journalists at Gannett-owned newsrooms across the U.S. who have gone on walkouts. I think many, if not all of them, are still trying to bargain their first contracts with Gannett after unionizing over the past 5 years. There's been a huge unionization wave in local journalism. because journalists, and I'm part of that. I was actually part of the original group that unionized the LA Times in 2018, which is a big deal. And so there's been this historic surge of journalists organizing and standing up and fighting it back against this plunder and fighting back against the hedge funds and standing up and saying that, like, we have a mission. We're the human beings who go out to the school board meeting, reporting on City Hall, and it feels as though no one cares about us. The companies that employ us are dominated by hedge funds. The tech platforms that are profiting from us don't seem to care whether we exist or not. And so if no one else is going to stand up for us, we're going to stand up for ourselves. And so what you're seeing at Gannett today is actually a really interesting joint strike action by a bunch of different unions at different Gannett newsrooms that came together and decided that, how do you hold this giant corporate conglomerate accountable? Because if any one of us goes on strike, it's really hard to hold a giant company accountable. This is like one of the major problems of like labor in America today. We have these giant companies like Amazon that represent workers all over the place. And so like, if you have one little place go out on a walkout, how significant is that? So these journalists, because we're smart, I would like to think, got together and said, well, let's build some power. Let's work together. Let's use our inherent value as journalists and as workers to withhold our labor. And if Gannett doesn't care about us as human beings, then maybe Gannett will care about seeing a zero in the revenue column. And maybe that's the only thing that, a hedge fund owned company will care about. And so I'm really proud of these journalists. It's really scary to go out on strike. They're really brave and they put a lot of work into it. And hopefully, Gannett sees how strong they are, and we start to see some real movement at the bargaining table so that these journalists can get their first contracts, because it's been too long.
And as you say, there's been a major upsurge in young journalists saying enough is enough. We need to have a decent living. We need to have a future as journalists. And basically, they're against the wall and they feel they have no future in the present situation. Is that the case?
That's completely correct. You can look at a lot of local newsrooms these days, and it used to be, if you would go into a newsroom 20 years ago, there'd be a lot of kind of older veteran journalists walking around who had been in the business for decades. They knew the sources, they knew the history of the town that they were working in. They had longtime relationships with their sources. But if you go to a lot of newsrooms today, it's a lot of really young people. It's people coming out of journalism school who have student debt, who are coming into an incredibly tough rental market in the town that they've just moved to. And they are, in some cases, making less than what people were making at these same newsrooms coming in as new employees 20 years ago. Like, in some places, the wages haven't risen, but they've even gone down, which is crazy. And it's not sustainable. And so that's part of why I think you see that a lot of these strikes are really youth-led. It's young people who are organizing these newsrooms. It's young people who have come out of journalism school with a lot of energy and a lot of hope and a lot of idealism, because you have to remember that these are people who want their communities to be served well. We want our communities to have information so that we can govern ourselves as we should in a democracy. And so these young people show up at these hedge fund controlled corporations in this environment of sort of fear and paranoia and poverty. Some of these people are making poverty level wages, and they're fighting up and standing back because it's the only logical thing left to do.
And the bill 886 passed the assembly with a high number of votes. However, Meta and Google are saying that they're going to basically pull the news from their platforms if this thing passes. What do you say about that? And also, they've made similar threats in Australia and in Europe, where legislation to protect journalists has also been put forward.
That's right. So Meta last week made this threat before the Assembly voted on passing the California Journalism Preservation Act. Look, this is corporate intimidation, plain and simple. In the labor world, we call this a capital strike. When a democracy, a government of people stands up and says, hey, we want to have some small say in how our communities function and the way that our economy works here. And then big multinational, international corporations like Meta and others will say, wait a second, we don't want to pay you any extra money for profiting off of your community. So if you don't like us that much, we're just going to get out of here. And so Meta has pulled this move over and over in many different countries. And in Australia, they actually banned news from Facebook for about 5 days when Australia passed a very similar law. And it was chaos because like Facebook's running around trying to figure out who it wants to ban and who it doesn't want to damn. I mean, look, this is just censorship. Let's just call it what it is. They're just running around trying to stop people from sharing news. And meanwhile, like wildfires are happening in Australia, and like it was chaos. And so in the end, the government came to Facebook and was like, well, maybe we'll change the law a little bit to make you a little bit happier. And so they actually, it was just bargaining. And so the government changed the law a bit, and Facebook's like, okay, we'll stop trying to ban journalism in Australia, which was insane. And so that kind of revealed Facebook's threat as what it was. It's an empty bargaining tactic that this powerful company wants to use against democratic governments anywhere that they want to say, hold on a second, like if you want to operate in our communities, we have to have some fair rules of the road. And apparently that's too much for Mark Zuckerberg. So I applaud California's assembly for standing up and seeing this threat for what it was, which is an empty bargaining tactic. And I think, I look forward to seeing how this bill is going to be discussed in the Senate. In the end, like I think it would be healthy if everybody can get on the same page about what a fair marketplace would look like for journalism. And then I think we need to have a conversation even after that and after this bill passes about like, okay, this is a nice intermediate step for trying to make, like digital journalism more fair. But, I'm somebody who thinks that like we do have to talk about the future of journalism beyond advertising, because there are lots of like local nonprofit newsrooms and lots of other newsrooms that are trying to build a future that isn't so advertising dependent. And I think that's really interesting. Subscriber models are potentially really interesting. Cooperatives by journalists are really interesting. I think we have to talk about all of this stuff because there is an opportunity for us to try to help remake journalism into something that is more suitable for us in the 21st century. Because I don't think the 20th century model of having like the big mega newspaper in the city that's staffed like 90% by white guys is going to be the future of journalism in the 21st century. I think we have to look forward, and I'm a white guy, so I hope that there's a future for me too in journalism. But I think this is an opportunity. We can sit down and talk to each other about like what are going to be the policies that help us get to providing journalism that our communities really need. So I do think some of that starts with holding Facebook and Meta and Google accountable. But like once we get there, I do think we still have a responsibility to talk about like, okay, we've won this big fight against big tech companies, but that's not going to be the end of our problems. We've got these hedge funds running around that we have to deal with. We've got these, we've just got these news deserts now where there aren't any newsrooms at all to try to rescue. Like we have to build something new. So how are you going to do that? I think there's a lot of conversations to happen in the days ahead, but I, for one, am really heartened that California's lawmakers are really interested in this issue. I can tell that, they see the negative effect of not having journalism in their communities because a lot of the laws that they passed are based off of good journalism, like local journalists who spot problems in their communities and say like, hey, something about our system's broken. So, I think this is one step among many that we have to take, but I'm hoping that we do take this one step.
And today in Apple and Cupertino, there's going to be a rally for the writers strike, and the CWA is joining that. The coders and other CWA unions, Apple workers are organizing it at Apple locations. And the issue of AI and the introduction of AI for the writers, they say it's an existential issue. Many of the writers that if it's allowed uncontrolled, it could actually destroy the entire industry. They'd all be turned into gig workers, and you wouldn't have any kind of serious product and craft. Do you see AI as a threat?
Yeah, I think it's a threat if the people who currently own our industries think it's the future. I think, look, we all use technology every single day to try to make our lives a little bit easier, and sometimes it's really great. I just spent the last 15 minutes or so complaining about Google and Meta. But look, I use their technology every day. I'm not anti-technology. I'm not somebody who thinks that like I need to go live in a cave and that's the only healthy way to be a human. Like, you know, I think engineers do really cool stuff and they make really amazing things. And if they can make things that make our lives better, then that's awesome. And so, you know, as a journalist, if I can use technology to help me read, you know, some data on campaign finance contributions with a little bit more insight, I think that would be amazing. Like if I could use an artificial intelligence engine to try to track down corporate black money donations that are supposed to be hard to trace, and you know, an artificial intelligence engine can make that easier, I think that would be great. I think that would be good for society. I think the problem is with artificial intelligence, and really with like any kind of other technology, is that the people who run these companies, the people who own these companies are interested in one thing, profits. And one of the ways that you increase profits is by lowering labor costs. And if you get some guy sitting in a corner office who looks at ChatGPT and thinks that ChatGPT can write a perfectly fine screenplay or a perfectly good newspaper story, that is the first step down the road to chaos. And so I think, you know, I think writers who are in the business of creative activity, human expression, human connection, you know, I think they're right to be concerned that, you know, a robot is not going to be as sensitive to, you know, the nuances of the human condition. Like it really isn't a push button craft to just like write a really brilliant movie or a great episode of TV. Like you need some human beings involved in, you know, sort of instilling our genius into the art of human connection. For journalists, for us, I think the issue is a lot more simple. Like this technology is pretty impressive, but like if you look at the way it works, it doesn't use reason. It's like a prediction mean. It's like it's fancy. It's a prediction machine. It's a fancy text prediction app like from your iPhone. It's just sees a sentence that you're typing and then it's like, oh, this would be a really interesting word to put next because a lot of other people have used this word when you have a sentence that looks like this. That's kind of an interesting mechanical concept, but if you're a journalist, that should terrify you because that means that the thing that is writing these sentences is writing them without any knowledge of whether it's actually true or not. There's so much potential for defamation, libel, bias that's built into this technology. You have no idea what data it's drawing from and whether that data was biased in its own way or had some sort of prejudices on a certain topic. And it's not actually using reason. It doesn't know whether the things it's saying are real or not. And at least when we're journalists and we're trying to do the science of journalism, we're trying to, you know, quote people by name and say, this thing happened on this date and this place. And if you don't believe me, you can go talk to people there and they'll tell you, yeah, that happened. Like it's pretty simple stuff. But I'll say that like, at least when I'm writing something down, I have some pretty good knowledge that it's probably true. And when my name is on that story, my readers should know that I believe that it's true too. But when it's ChatGPT, you have no idea what you're getting into.
Well, the technology is being developed now. It's in fact, there's a capitalist speculative campaign. You know, they're all investing billions now to make a fortune on the development of this technology. The Industrial Revolution led to the destruction of the guilds of sewers. A whole industry was wiped out. You had the Luddites who fought it. You think that this transformation using AI has that potential effect? I mean, Goldman Sachs has said that there may be a loss of 300 million jobs. That's a massive thing. Radiologists, attorneys, architects. I mean, there are all kinds of professions that could be threatened by this. And the question of control: who's going to control it? Who's going to own it? And who is it going to benefit?
Yeah, I think those are really brilliant, critical questions. I mean, you know, again, I'm somebody who kind of I have a bit of a nuanced feeling about this, which is that, like, let's say you're a cancer doctor and there's an artificial intelligence engine that can help you read cancer screenings and help you identify a tumor more accurately or earlier in the process. I think if you're talking about technology that can help doctors and help patients, that would be great. That would be brilliant. That would literally be life-saving. But I think we're talking about like completely replacing the doctor with a robot that literally doesn't care whether you live or die. That's something where you start crossing the line. And so I'm somebody who, I think the Luddites got a bad reputation through history. If you go back and look at them, they're primarily concerned about this technology, this automation ruining people's lives, which at the time and in that context it did. If you talk about the sort of devastating transformations of the Industrial Revolution, like a lot of human beings were sacrificed on that wheel. So, again, I'm somebody who believes in progress. I'm somebody who thinks that there's a lot of hopeful potential involved in technology that can help us solve some really basic existential human problems, or at least make life just a little bit easier. But I think it's more likely that life's going to be a little bit easier and a little bit better if it's workers who are looking at this technology and figuring out if it actually works, and the workers who are making the determinations like, well, yeah, actually this could be really good if it's helping me, spot cancer more easily. But if it's like, the factory owner is like, well, this will help me get rid of all the humans, and then all I can do is just sit behind my desk and collect revenues while, I sit alone in my factory, that seems a little bit that seems a little bit more inhuman. Look, there's an economic case that, like, some types of automation, like, it disrupts some jobs in one place and then creates more jobs in another. That seems to have been the case for, the last several dozens of years. But I think a lot of us also know that, like, it's really crappy to be the person who gets automated, because you're the one who went to college or got all this training to be really good at, putting a car together, or who got really good at, radiology or something. And then this technology comes along and erases, the 10 or 15 years it took to make you a really brilliant, excellent worker. That's really hard. And I think if we're going to have those sorts of disruptions, then it's our responsibility as a community to say, like, okay, well, either we need to, like, slow down that sort of disruption from happening, or we need to have, like, a real plan for how to help people who get displaced by this technology. Because I don't want to do the parts of my job that suck. I think a lot of people don't want to do the parts of their job that suck. Like, people don't like or intrinsically enjoy filling out paperwork. If I can get a robot to fill out paperwork for me, that sounds great. But I want to still do the parts of my job that I enjoy, like talking to people, learning new things, trying to transmit that knowledge to people in a sort of creative, compelling, human way. So it's complicated, and I think a lot of people are going to have different opinions about it, different feelings about it. I'm hopeful that as long as people are learning about the issue and also not just buying into the hype the way that I think a lot of people bought into the crypto hype, there are risks that we are also looking at another, like, crypto style craze where the same venture capitalists who are like, oh my God, crypto is the future of all money and currency, and then the market crashes after 1 or 2 years of that. It's entirely possible that we're looking at something similar, because it is the same people, I should say. Like, it's the same tech people who were hyping the other old brilliant future technology of the last couple of years ago, who are now like, oh my God, wait, no, not crypto. Crypto's not the future. Blockchain's not the future anymore. It's AI. AI is the future. So I think we do have to have some skepticism for all the doomsaying and all the fear mongering about how this is going to destroy the world, because in some ways that is an advertisement for these companies that want to demonstrate how impressive their product is. I think if they were really concerned that the stuff was going to destroy humanity, they would probably stop making it, but they haven't done that.
Well, you do have the situation, for example, at Twitter, where Elon Musk took it over and then laid off 75% of the workers at Twitter, and it's still going. And if other tech companies think they can do similar things, we're talking about a massive downsizing of tech workers. All these workers who've spent their lives developing their skills, their talents in this industry, maybe can be automated out of their jobs. That's a frightening thing for a lot of tech workers, I would.
Yeah, I think Twitter is actually a great comparison, because you could look at that situation and say, well, this industrialist came in and laid off all these people, and the company's still there. It's like it didn't explode after 2 weeks like some people predicted. You can still go on there and tweet. So Seems perfectly fine, right? And so I think anybody who looks at that as a success story is sort of emblematic of how risky this conversation about AI is. Because if you start like looking under the hood at Twitter, like advertising revenue is down dramatically at Twitter because so many advertisers have gotten so spooked by like, the sort of hate mongering accounts that have come back. You can now purchase a blue badge that puts you at the top of like, responses. So if you have a controversial post, the people who are seen at the top of your responses aren't the people who had the smartest response. They aren't the people who had the kind of like most naturally engaging response. It's like the people who purchased real estate beneath your tweet so that they could like, say whatever it is that they're going to say. And like, look, I don't know. I'm like, I don't mind like hearing from people who have different opinions from me, even if it's a little hurtful. But I think the quality has gone down significantly on Twitter. I see it as somebody who's been a hardcore Twitter user for more than 10 years. A lot of my own friends and colleagues have left the service, and it's just like the platform is just significantly less useful to me than it used to be. It's a lot buggier than it used to be. It seems like the ownership doesn't actually want to have me around, especially as a journalist. So it's just, for me, the shine is really off of Twitter. And so like, yeah, I look back and I say, well, yeah, actually, you really do miss a lot of those people, because a lot of those people were the ones that were trying to make the service, somewhat functional, safe, welcoming. They're experimenting with some different tools that might make Twitter more interesting to use. A lot of those people are gone now. It doesn't seem like there's anybody inside the company who's willing to tell the owner no. And, the owner is very impetuous and probably needs to be told no, like a lot of owners. So I feel like I see those consequences in the product. And so like, just to map that onto like the Hollywood discussion, like imagine like a studio boss who replaces a whole writing team with Chat GPT. And it's like, well, there's still a script. We can still use that script to make a TV show, and now we don't have to pay all these expensive writers' salaries and their healthcare plan that we negotiated with the union. We can still make movies, but I think odds are pretty good that like the people watching the movie are gonna be like, this movie really sucks. Like there's something about it seems really kind of weird and boring. And I don't think people understand how boring the future could be in a world without workers. Adding a little bit of life and creativity and that sort of essential human component of any kind of activity that is what kind of makes the world go around. Like, what do I care what a robot has to say about the human condition? They're just like plagiarizing off of the last 300 years of Shakespeare and Laurence Olivier and all these great artists who made this craft what it was.
Okay. Matt, well, how can people support 886 if they want to get support for that bill in the Senate?
So, contact your senator and say, I support AB 886, the California Journalism Preservation Act. It's facing a lot of opposition from the tech lobby. There's a lot of astroturfing out there. But know this, the unions that represent journalists in California support this legislation. The workers who are actually out there in our communities doing journalism are the ones who support this bill. So I think I'm looking forward to a really interesting debate in the Senate. I think it's likely that it may take on some amendments because, the sponsors said they still want to work on it a bit and make sure that it makes sense for everybody. And they are trying to, I think, take some of the criticisms into account. And I think that's a healthy part of the legislative process. And so, but I do think that I would encourage people to look beyond the fear mongering from the tech lobby on this bill and the astroturf groups that are trying to kill this bill, because ultimately, if you look at who's profiting from the work that's being done by local journalists, and if you look at the vast wasteland of misinformation that surrounds us every time we go online or try to look up something about our local communities, then I think you would agree with me that something seems really broken. And I'm really excited for one that policymakers in California have decided to take a shot at trying to turn back that tide.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with Matt Pearce. He is the president of Media Guild of the West. He works at the Los Angeles Times, and he was discussing with us this bill 886 and also new developments in technology, AI, and local news, and how working people and the public will be affected by these developments. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Steve. It was a pleasure to be on.